Before we descend into the darkest corners of history, let us pause and ask, why do humans do this to one another? Across empires, across centuries, men created machines of agony not only to kill, but to humiliate, to terrify, to break the spirit. These stories are not merely about pain, they are about power, about how far cruelty can go when it is given purpose. And as you watch this video, I want you to remember something. Even now, in our modern age, cruelty still exists. People still harm, still torture, still oppress. The faces have changed, the tools are different, but the suffering remains. Let us share with you these tales from the shadows of history, not to glorify them, but to remind ourselves of what must never be repeated. May those who commit acts of cruelty, in any age, never escape justice.
The Brazen Bull. In the scorched sun of ancient Greece, in the heart of Sicily, stood the proud city of Acragas. Its temples gleamed with marble, its streets bustled with merchants and philosophers, and its rulers craved monuments that would echo their power for centuries. Yet behind the facade of culture and progress lay a darkness so profound that it would sear its way into history. That darkness took the form of a machine, a device of bronze, fire, and screams, the infamous Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull was not born out of necessity, nor was it designed for war. It was crafted from ambition, ego, and cruelty. The story begins with Perilos, a craftsman of Athens whose genius was matched only by his hunger for recognition. He envisioned a device unlike any other, a hollow statue of a bull, cast entirely from bronze, with a door on its side large enough to admit a man. But this was no mere statue to adorn a temple. Perilos intended it as an instrument of terror, a contraption that would transform human suffering into both spectacle and art. Inside the hollow belly of the bull, a man or woman would be locked, helpless and trembling. Beneath the belly, a fire would be kindled, its flames licking the metal, heating it until the bronze glowed red with unbearable intensity. Slowly, the body within would roast alive. Yet the true innovation and the true horror lay not only in the burning, but in the sound. Perilos, ever the engineer, constructed a system of tubes and pipes in the head of the bull. As the victims screamed in agony, their cries would be transformed by the mechanism into sounds that resembled the bellow of a furious animal. From the outside, the crowd would hear not human voices, but the chilling roar of a beast, as though the bull itself had come to life in rage and pain. Perilos carried his design to Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas. Phalaris was a man known for cruelty, a ruler feared by his subjects and envied by his peers. When he saw the Brazen Bull, he did not recoil in horror. He smiled. Here was a tool to keep his people in line, to silence dissent, and to instill fear so deep that rebellion would never again take root. Phalaris commissioned the creation of the bull, paying Perilos handsomely. The statue was forged in shining bronze, polished until it gleamed in the Sicilian sun. It was not hidden in dungeons or shadowy chambers. It stood proudly in public, a reminder of what awaited those who defied the tyrant. But cruelty is a hungry beast, and it devours even those who believe it commands it. When the bull was completed, Phalaris turned to Perilos with a smile that carried a cruel twist. He invited the inventor to demonstrate his masterpiece. Perilos, eager to please, explained how the screams would echo like music, how the mechanism would make suffering sound like the song of the beast. Phalaris listened, nodding, until he commanded, "Show me." The craftsman hesitated, but the tyrant's soldiers seized him. Perilos, the father of the invention, was shoved inside his own creation. The door was bolted shut, the fire lit. As the flames rose, the bronze grew hot, and the screams began. Outside, the crowd heard the bull bellow for the first time. Its roar filled the square, a sound both human and profoundly human. Perilos perished within the very machine he had designed. The brazen bull became a symbol of Phalaris's reign. Enemies, traitors, and innocents alike were dragged to its gaping maw. Some begged for mercy, others cursed the tyrant until the flames took their breath. All met the same fate, roasted alive, their voices transformed into the haunting song of the bronze beast. The sight of smoke rising from its nostrils and the sound of its hollow roar etched terror into the hearts of the city's inhabitants. Children whispered of it in their beds, mothers wept at the thought of it, and fathers prayed never to hear it again. What made the brazen bull so monstrous was not only the suffering it inflicted, but the spectacle it created. Pain was turned into theater, death into performance. The very act of execution became entertainment for the tyrant, a twisted symphony of fire and bronze. In this way, the bull transcended mere punishment. It became a statement: defy Phalaris, and you will not simply die. You will be consumed in fire, and your agony will be immortalized as the cry of a beast. Yet fate has a way of punishing tyrants. Phalaris himself, years later, was overthrown by those who could no longer bear his cruelty. When his enemies seized him, they did not seek subtlety or mercy. They dragged him to the very bull he had used to strike fear into countless victims. The door clanged shut, the fire was lit, and soon the tyrant himself was bellowing from within. His screams joined the chorus of those he had condemned, his flesh roasting as the crowd watched in grim satisfaction. The creator and the tyrant, both claimed by the same infernal invention. The brazen bull did not vanish with Phalaris. The idea of it, an instrument of pure spectacle, a theater of cruelty, echoed across history. Ancient writers recorded it as a warning of tyranny's excess. The image of the bronze beast, glowing red with fire, became an eternal symbol of how ingenuity, when twisted by malice, can create horrors that defy imagination. Imagine, for a moment, the scene at the square. At dusk, the statue gleaming in the dying light, the smell of smoke in the air. A victim dragged forward, their pleas drowned out by the jeers of soldiers. The iron door slamming shut, then silence, broken only by the crackle of firewood beneath. Minutes pass, the bronze grows brighter, and finally the first scream, muffled, distorted, transformed into the guttural roar of a beast that was never alive. The crowd recoils, yet they cannot look away. The sound is horrifying, grotesque, yet mesmerizing. And then, when it is done, only ash and silence remain. This was not punishment. It was terror, weaponized and perfected. It was artistry and cruelty, designed not just to kill, but to remind the living that their ruler held the power of life and death in his hands, and that defiance would be answered not with exile, not with chains, but with fire and bronze. The brazen bull stands as one of history's most terrifying instruments of torture. It is a reminder of how the pursuit of glory and fear can consume both the tyrant and the creator. In the end, it was not just a machine of death, it was a monument to human cruelty, a lesson carved in bronze, echoing with the screams of the damned.
The Judas Cradle. In the dimly lit chambers of medieval Europe, where justice was often little more than cruelty cloaked in ritual, there existed a device that combined humiliation, prolonged agony, and unspeakable violation. Its name was the Judas Cradle, though some knew it by another title, the Judas Chair. It was an instrument not of swift execution, but of deliberate torment, designed to strip a human being not only of life, but of dignity itself. The Judas Cradle was deceptively simple in its construction. At first glance, it resembled a small stool, supported by sturdy legs. But instead of a seat, there rose a sharp, pyramidal point, crafted of wood or iron, polished smooth yet mercilessly hard. The victim, bound and shackled, would be suspended above this point. Ropes or chains were attached to their wrists and ankles, and slowly, with mechanical precision, the victim would be lowered down until the sharp tip pressed against the most vulnerable parts of the body. The terror of the Judas Cradle lay not only in its brutality, but in its precision. The pointed pyramid was aimed directly at the anus or the genitals. As the ropes tightened and the victim descended, the tip began to penetrate, slowly, inevitably. The weight of the body did the rest, driving the victim deeper onto the point. The process was agonizingly slow, pain increasing with every fraction of an inch, nerves screaming with white-hot fire. Some victims fainted from the shock, only to be revived by buckets of water so that their torment could continue. The executioners prided themselves on their control. They could choose whether the descent was rapid, tearing flesh in an instant, or gradual, dragging the agony out for hours, even days. The victim's own weight became the instrument of their suffering. Every breath, every twitch, every futile attempt to struggle only forced them lower. To prolong the torment, the torturers often tied ropes in such a way that the victim's descent could be halted midway, leaving them impaled but not yet fatally. In this suspended state, they would writhe, scream, and bleed, yet cling desperately to life. The cruelty did not end with pain. The Judas Cradle was designed to degrade. Victims were stripped naked, displayed before crowds or inquisitors, their humiliation as much a punishment as their physical suffering. Infection was inevitable. The point was rarely cleaned, often smeared with filth or deliberately contaminated with excrement. Days of torment would leave the body ravaged by sepsis, disease spreading from the torn flesh. Death did not come swiftly. It arrived as fever, delirium, and the slow collapse of the body's defenses. This device was often employed during the Inquisition, when accusations of heresy could condemn even the innocent to horrors beyond imagination. Men and women accused of witchcraft, blasphemy, or treason found themselves bound above the pyramid, forced to confess under the unbearable promise of descent. Some broke after minutes, others endured hours before their will shattered. But whether guilty or not, once they had been strapped to the cradle, their fate was sealed. Imagine the scene: a cold stone chamber, torches flickering against damp walls, the heavy scent of sweat and smoke thick in the air. A prisoner is dragged forward, their eyes wide with terror, their cries echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The torturers grin as they tighten the ropes, suspending the body just inches above the waiting point. For a moment, there is silence, just the crackle of flames and the drip of water. Then the descent begins. The victim howls, body jerking violently, chains rattling with desperate force. The sound of flesh tearing mixes with the screams, a grotesque symphony of pain. The inquisitor looks on, face expressionless, waiting for the confession that will justify the cruelty. But even confession did not guarantee release. The Judas Cradle was not a tool of justice. It was a performance of power. To endure it was to be broken in both body and spirit. Some victims, too shattered to speak, could only sob incoherently as their bodies betrayed them. Others prayed for death, begging their captors to end the torment. Yet death was rarely granted quickly. The cradle was a masterpiece of prolonged suffering, a device that turned life itself into the instrument of torture. There were accounts of victims who lingered for days. Lowered only a fraction at a time, they remained impaled, unable to move, their muscles cramping, their wounds festering. Guards fed them just enough water to keep them alive, prolonging the ordeal. At night, their cries echoed through the dark corridors, a haunting reminder to others imprisoned nearby of what awaited them should they resist. What makes the Judas Cradle so horrifying is not only its physical brutality, but its psychological cruelty. It attacked the very core of human dignity, reducing its victims to objects of ridicule and suffering. To die upon it was to be remembered not for one's life, but for the grotesque spectacle of one's end. And yet, like so many instruments of medieval torment, the Judas Cradle was not the product of barbarians, but of a society that considered itself civilized. It was born of courts and inquisitions, of men in robes who claimed to serve God and justice. In their hands, suffering became righteous, and cruelty became sanctified. The cradle was not hidden away in shadows. It was displayed as a symbol of authority, a warning to all who might question the order of the world. When we look back on the Judas Cradle today, we see not only a device of unimaginable torment, but a reflection of the darkest corners of human nature. It reminds us that cruelty often disguises itself in the language of law, that the instruments of power can be forged into tools of horror. And above all, it stands as a chilling testament to how far mankind can go when fear, faith, and authority are twisted into weapons.
Scaphism. Among all the cruelties devised by mankind, there are some that stand apart, not because they end life swiftly, but because they corrupt the very essence of living, turning existence into a slow descent through madness, disease, and decay. One such method, born in the heart of the Persian Empire, has echoed through the corridors of history with a name as strange as its horror: Scaphism. It was known also as the boats, and it was not only an execution, but a public spectacle of unimaginable suffering. The procedure was deceptively simple in its preparation, and yet profoundly ingenious in its cruelty. The condemned was stripped naked, every inch of their body exposed to sun and air. Then they were placed between two hollowed-out logs or boats, their limbs protruding from holes so that they could not move, their head forced upright to breathe and witness every moment of their torment. The boats were sealed around them, enclosing their body tightly, leaving only arms, legs, and face visible. They were alive, conscious, and utterly trapped. But entrapment was only the beginning. Next came the offering of food, milk, and honey, forced down the victim's throat until they could consume no more. The sweetness turned into sickness, their stomach bloated, their bowels loosened. Then more honey was smeared upon their skin, especially their eyes, mouth, and the tender places of the body. The scent drew flies, wasps, and every crawling insect within reach. The condemned could not brush them away. They could not move at all. The insects landed, crawled, bit, and stung, feeding on the sticky coating that covered their flesh. The sun blazed down, day after day, baking the honey into the skin, inflaming the wounds made by countless stings. At night, the damp air chilled the victim, their body shivering, but the insects never ceased. Maggots and larvae found their way into wounds, into the mouth, the nose, the eyes. The victim was alive through it all, forced to endure the slow transformation of their body into a hive of corruption. The genius of Scaphism lay not in immediate pain, but in prolongation. Victims lingered for days, even weeks, as their flesh rotted while they still breathed. The honey, the milk, the confinement, all ensured that life was extended just enough for death to be delayed. The bowels emptied uncontrollably, the stench rising as waste mingled with decay, drawing more vermin. Rats and larger creatures came, gnawing at the exposed flesh, emboldened by the victim's inability to resist. Each moment became a new layer of torment. Burning sun, crawling insects, swelling infection, and the ceaseless humiliation
of being consumed alive. Historical accounts describe the execution of a Persian noble condemned for treason. Placed between the boats, he endured for more than 2 weeks, his body slowly becoming unrecognizable, yet his consciousness clinging to the nightmare until merciful death finally arrived. The onlookers whispered in horror, yet the rulers considered it justice, a punishment fitting for betrayal, a warning to all who might conspire against the throne. To imagine Scaphism is to imagine the stripping away not just of life, but of humanity. The victim became an object, a feast for vermin, a living corpse trapped in the threshold between existence and death. The cruelty was theatrical, performed not in secret, but in public, so that the cries of the condemned and the sight of their corruption would sear themselves into the memory of all who witnessed. Perhaps what is most terrifying about Scaphism is that it weaponized nature itself. The executioners did not need blades, or fire, or iron. They only needed the sun, the insects, the inevitability of decay. By trapping the victim in this grotesque coffin of boats, they allowed the world itself to become the torturer. Every buzzing fly, every crawling worm, every gnawing rat was a collaborator in the theater of death. And through it all, the victim's mind remained, aware, horrified, begging for an end that did not come. The passage of time, once a comfort to men, became the cruelest enemy. Every hour brought not relief, but deeper agony. Days blurred together, each one an eternity of thirst, fever, and the endless assault of vermin. In the end, when the victim finally expired, the body was scarcely recognizable as human. It was a husk, bloated, consumed, hollowed by insects and decay. The boats were pried open, and what spilled forth was not the form of a man but a grotesque reminder of what happens when cruelty is given full rein. Scaphism stands in history as a symbol of how inventive human beings can be when cruelty merges with imagination. It is a lesson not only in torture, but in the capacity of societies to justify horror in the name of power. The Persians who devised it believed they were serving justice, yet what they truly served was fear. And centuries later, we remember Scaphism not for the justice it claimed, but for the horror it inflicted. Imagine for a moment, lying in that wooden prison, the sun blazing overhead, the sticky sweetness of honey drying upon your skin. You feel the first tickle of flies landing, then the sharp sting as they bite. Hours pass, your throat aches with thirst, but still they come. Flies, ants, beetles, gnats, each one leaving its mark. By the second day, your body is a battlefield of bites and sores, the air thick with buzzing. By the third, maggots writhe in your wounds, rats gnaw at your feet. You scream, but your voice is hoarse, drowned out by the ceaseless drone of insects. By the seventh day, your body is swollen, fevered, your skin breaking open in ulcers. Yet you still breathe. You still endure. That was the genius of Scaphism. Death did not come as mercy, but as the final chapter in a play of endless suffering.
The Iron Maiden. In the cold, echoing dungeons of medieval Europe, where stone walls drank in the screams of the condemned, there emerged a device that embodied terror not just in its pain, but in its appearance. It was tall, towering, a figure both grotesque and majestic, shaped in the likeness of a woman, yet forged entirely of iron. Its very presence struck fear into prisoners, for it was not only a coffin, but a coffin with teeth, the infamous Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden stood as tall as a man, often taller, its surface carved or molded into the likeness of a stern-faced woman or a saint. Its front opened on hinges like doors, revealing a hollow interior just wide enough for a human body. At first glance, it seemed little more than a sarcophagus, but then the eyes would notice the inside, lined with spikes, long and sharp, gleaming in torchlight. They were positioned with cruel precision, not randomly, but carefully, so that when the victim was enclosed inside, the spikes would pierce flesh without immediately killing. They would stab the shoulders, the arms, the legs, the abdomen, even the cheeks, missing vital organs by inches, ensuring pain, not mercy. To be condemned to the Iron Maiden was to face death not as an instant, but as a slow bleeding, an agony drawn out in darkness. The prisoner was stripped, bound, and shoved inside. The doors closed with a heavy thud, metal against metal. And as they did, the spikes bit into skin. The victim screamed as points punctured flesh, but the maiden offered no escape. Every movement drove the spikes deeper. Breathing itself became torment as the chest expanded against iron thorns. The silence that followed was broken only by muffled cries, the sound of dripping blood, the creak of chains as the device swayed slightly with the struggles within. Hours passed. The wounds bled slowly, not enough to end life swiftly, but enough to weaken, to drain. Infection festered in the punctures. The darkness pressed in, suffocating the senses. For some, madness arrived before death, the blackness and the pain combining into a prison of the mind as well as the body. What made the Iron Maiden so terrifying was not only the death it dealt, but the theater it represented. To see the device standing in a dungeon was enough to force confessions, to break spirits. Many prisoners begged for mercy at the sight of its looming figure, choosing to betray comrades, faith, or family rather than face its embrace. The maiden was thus as much psychological weapon as it was instrument of execution. Historians tell of its use in Nuremberg in the late Middle Ages, where it became infamous as both symbol and tool. Some records claim that blasphemers were sentenced to her embrace, their tongues pierced so that they could no longer speak. Others describe her use against traitors, who were shut inside and left to bleed for days. Whether all of these accounts are precise or exaggerated, the legend of the Iron Maiden grew, cementing its place in the catalog of humanity's darkest inventions. Imagine standing before it, torchlight flickering across its iron face, shadows stretching like claws across the walls. The executioner's hands press against your back, the doors swing wide to reveal the glittering teeth within. You beg, you plead, but the chamber cares not. You're thrust forward, the spikes meet you with cold precision, and the doors slam shut. The world narrows to blackness, pierced by pain. You feel your own blood trickling down your skin, the points embedded deep. Hours pass, then days as you fade into silence, your body reduced to a husk pressed against iron. There is also the symbolism, the fact that this monstrosity was shaped in the form of a woman, a figure of supposed mercy and nurture. To die inside her was a grotesque inversion of the idea of protection. The womb of iron did not give life, it consumed it. The maiden was a mother of death, a parody of comfort, an embrace that offered only despair. Some have argued that the Iron Maiden was more myth than reality, that stories of its use were exaggerated to demonize past rulers. Perhaps so. But whether legend or fact, its imagery is undeniable. The very idea of standing upright in a coffin of spikes, alive and aware, has haunted imaginations for centuries. That is the power of the Iron Maiden. Even if it were never used as frequently as tales claim, the terror it inspired was as real as any blade or chain. In the end, the Iron Maiden represents the cruel artistry of human invention. It was never just about ending a life. It was about sending a message, about transforming punishment into performance. It was about fear, wielded as a weapon stronger than iron itself. And so, in the pages of history, the Iron Maiden stands not only as a device of execution, but as a symbol of the human capacity for cruelty masked as justice. Her hollow body may now be empty, silent, a relic in museums, but within her iron ribs still echoed the screams of those who once trembled at her sight.
The Catherine Wheel. In the long, brutal centuries of medieval Europe, where justice was sharpened on the edge of fear, there was a punishment so infamous that its very mention could silence a crowd. It was called the breaking wheel, but history remembers it also as the Catherine Wheel, a name that mingled faith, martyrdom, and unimaginable cruelty. Unlike hidden dungeons or secret tortures, this was a punishment carried out in the open, beneath the sky, before the eyes of the living. It was not simply about killing. It was about making death last as long as possible, until the condemned was no longer a man or woman, but a shattered ruin, both body and soul. The wheel itself was an ordinary object at first glance, a great wooden wagon wheel, tall and broad, its spokes thick and sturdy, its rim reinforced with iron. But in the hands of executioners, it was transformed into a stage of horror. The condemned would be bound spread-eagle upon it, arms and legs lashed to the spokes. Sometimes they were tied across the wheel, stretched into a grotesque parody of the human form. Other times they were laid on the ground, limbs splayed, while the wheel itself was wielded as a weapon. The process began with breaking. The executioner, armed with a heavy iron bar or hammer, approached the helpless body. Before the eyes of the gathered crowd, villagers, nobles, even children, the hammer rose and fell. First the legs, shattering bones into splinters, then the arms, crushed into useless fragments. Each blow drew a scream, a howl of agony that mingled with the gasps of the onlookers. The body convulsed, but there was no escape, no defense. One by one, the limbs were broken, the flesh mangled, the bones shattered, until the condemned was little more than a writhing bundle of pain. But still, it was not over. Once the body had been broken, the executioners wove it through the spokes of the wheel, twisting and bending the shattered limbs into the gaps. The wheel was then raised upright, displayed high on a post or scaffold, like some grotesque crucifixion. There the victim remained, bleeding, broken, their face swollen with pain, their voice hoarse from screaming. They hung in the open air, exposed to sun, wind, rain, and the gaze of every passerby. The cruelty of the Catherine Wheel lay not only in the destruction of the body, but in the deliberate prolongation of death. Victims sometimes lived for days, their wounds festering, their thirst burning, their minds drifting between agony and delirium. Crows and vultures descended to peck at the exposed flesh. Flies gathered on the open sores. The wheel turned the human form into a feast for both the elements and the animals. To die upon it was not a moment of execution, but a process of slow dissolution. In some accounts, the executioners showed a grim artistry. They calculated their blows so as to avoid vital organs, ensuring that the condemned would remain conscious for as long as possible. Limbs were struck in precise order, first the shins, then the thighs, then the arms, moving inward, each break increasing the torment. The rhythm of bone upon bone was as much ritual as punishment, a grim performance meant to terrify the crowd as much as to destroy the victim. The Catherine Wheel was not merely a punishment, it was a theater of fear. It turned death into spectacle, suffering into warning, and though the centuries have dulled its presence, its legacy endures in language, in memory, and in the haunting thought of what it meant to be broken, not only in body, but in spirit.
Rat torture. In the shadowy annals of human cruelty, some punishments strike not with the cold steel of iron or the burning touch of fire, but with the primal terror of nature itself. Among the most dreadful of these was a method that weaponized hunger, fear, and the gnawing teeth of vermin. Known simply as rat torture, it was a punishment whispered in dungeons, recorded in chronicles of war, and feared across continents. It was not the invention of one nation or one age. It surfaced in China, in Europe, in South America. Wherever desperation met cruelty, Men found ways to turn rats into executioners. The method varied, but its essence remained the same. A rat, driven by hunger or panic, would be forced to chew through the living body of a victim. The setup was both simple and horrifying. The condemned was bound, often naked or partially stripped, their body rendered helpless against what was to come. Then, a cage or a pot containing one or more rats was fastened against the flesh, commonly the stomach, chest, or buttocks. The cage was sealed, so that the only possible escape for the animal was through the victim's body. Then came the catalyst, heat. The executioner would place hot coals or a burning torch upon the outer surface of the cage or pot, driving the rat into a frenzy. The animal, desperate to escape the searing heat, turned in the only direction it could, downward, into flesh. With its sharp claws and gnawing teeth, it began to burrow. Skin split, blood poured, and screams filled the chamber as the rat clawed and chewed through living tissue, searching for escape. The agony was indescribable, pain mixed with the psychological terror of being eaten alive from within. In some variations, no fire was needed. The rat, already starved, was left confined against the victim's body for hours, days even. Its hunger grew unbearable, and at last it began to feed. The victim, trapped and conscious, felt every bite, every movement of the creature tunneling into their body. Survival instinct drove the rat deeper, through muscle and sinew, into organs, leaving behind trails of agony. Rat torture was not merely about death. It was about breaking the human spirit. The thought of vermin, filthy, disease-ridden creatures invading the sanctity of the body struck at a primal fear. Victims often confessed before the process had even begun, trembling at the mere sight of the cage. Those who resisted met a fate more dreadful than any blade could deliver. A death slow, humiliating, and grotesque, reduced from human to carrion. Accounts of this torment surface in diverse histories. In imperial China, chronicles describe rebels and traitors subjected to rats released upon their bound forms, gnawing their way through tender flesh. In medieval Europe, inquisitors found in rats a tool both cheap and effective, an executioner that required no training. Even centuries later, in times of political unrest in South America, reports surfaced of rats being used against prisoners, cages strapped to bellies, fires lit beneath, screams echoing through the night. The method was timeless because it required no invention, only cruelty and the natural instincts of an animal. Imagine the scene. A dungeon, its air thick with the stench of mildew and sweat. A prisoner lies bound, eyes wide with terror. Beside him, the executioner places a metal cage, inside it the restless scratching of a rat. The cage is pressed against the bare stomach, straps tightening, metal biting into skin. Then, with deliberate slowness, hot coals are piled on top. The cage grows warm, then hot, then searing. The rat squeals, panics, thrashes. The victim feels the claws first, scratching desperately against the skin, then the sharp puncture of teeth. The rat bites, once, twice, then again, until the flesh yields. Blood wells, the victim screams, and the rat pushes forward, desperate to escape the burning cage. And so begins the journey inward, every second a fresh eruption of agony. Rat torture had no dignity. Unlike the scaffold or the gallows, it offered no final words, no solemn moment before death. It was pure degradation. The victim's body became a vessel, a prison for vermin, their humanity stripped away as onlookers recoiled in horror or laughed in cruel fascination. Some prisoners lingered for hours, their bodies twitching as the rats burrowed. Others perished quickly, their hearts giving out from the shock and terror. But all who faced the cage shared the same fate, a death that reduced them to food for creatures they once might have crushed beneath their heel. What makes rat torture unforgettable is the way it turns the natural order upside down. Man, who prides himself as master of animals, finds himself prey. The rat, despised as pestilence, becomes the executioner. The victim, once a human being, becomes the ground into which vermin dig their escape. It is a punishment that destroys not just the body, but the idea of human superiority, leaving behind only horror. In the long catalog of torture, rat torture stands as one of the most grotesque, not because of elaborate machinery or ingenious design, but because of its simplicity. It required no great invention, no complex mechanism, only a cage, a fire, and the pitiless instincts of a starving animal. That simplicity made it versatile, transportable, adaptable to any dungeon or battlefield. And in its simplicity lay its terror, the reminder that sometimes the cruelest executioner is not man at all, but nature itself, twisted into a weapon.
Impalement in the Ottoman Empire. Among the many punishments that history records, few inspire the same visceral horror as impalement, the slow, merciless act of driving a stake through the body and leaving the condemned to die upon it. While tales of impalement are often tied to Vlad the Impaler of Wallachia, the practice was not his alone. Across empires and centuries, impalement was employed as a grim spectacle of power. In the Ottoman Empire, it stood as one of the harshest forms of justice, reserved for rebels, traitors, and those who defied imperial authority. The mechanics of impalement were cruel in their simplicity. A sharpened wooden stake, thick at its base and tapered at its end, was driven firmly into the ground. The condemned was stripped and bound, their wrists and ankles tied to prevent resistance. Then came the brutal act. The stake was forced into the body, most often through the anus or the vagina, and driven upward with deliberate force. Care was taken by skilled executioners to avoid vital organs, ensuring that the victim did not die swiftly. The stake would emerge from the shoulder, the chest, or even through the mouth, leaving the victim skewered like an obscene banner. Once impaled, the victim was hoisted upright, the stake planted firmly in the earth. There they remained, alive, screaming, writhing, displayed before the eyes of the public. Some died within hours, others lingered for days, the weight of their body slowly dragging them downward upon the stake, tearing flesh and rupturing organs with excruciating slowness. Birds descended to peck at exposed wounds. Insects gathered at the scent of blood. The sun scorched their skin by day, and the cold gnawed their bones by night. Death came not as a single moment, but as a process of unimaginable agony. The Ottomans, like many empires, used impalement not only as punishment, but as theater. It was a public display designed to terrify. The sight of a man writhing upon a stake in the center of a city square or at the gates of a fortress sent a message more powerful than any decree. Defy the Sultan, betray the empire, and this will be your fate. Chroniclers record that during uprisings, captured rebels were impaled in rows, their screams echoing across the fields, their bodies left as grotesque signposts of imperial wrath. Travelers from Europe who witnessed these punishments wrote of their horror in journals and letters, spreading the reputation of Ottoman justice far and wide. They described fields lined with stakes, each bearing the contorted figure of a victim, their faces frozen in agony. Some accounts speak of executioners who prided themselves on prolonging life, angling the stake so that the condemned could survive for days. Others tell of victims left to rot upon their stakes, their corpses serving as carrion for crows, their bones bleaching in the sun as warnings that endured long after their voices had fallen silent. Impalement in the Ottoman world was not arbitrary. It was reserved for crimes considered most heinous: treason, rebellion, desertion, and betrayal of the state. Pirates captured along the Mediterranean were sometimes impaled along the shores as warnings to others. Rebels in the Balkans met the same fate, their bodies raised upon stakes in the aftermath of crushed uprisings. The spectacle was meant to burn itself into memory, pain turned into propaganda, suffering into submission. To imagine the experience is to confront the limits of human endurance. Bound, stripped, and thrust upon the stake, the condemned felt the first puncture like fire, then the tearing, the splitting of muscle and bone. Breath came in ragged gasps, every movement driving the stake deeper. Time stretched into an endless nightmare. Day became night, night became day, but still the agony endured. At last, fever, blood loss, and exhaustion overcame them, and silence replaced screams. But even in death, the body remained, grotesque and defiant, a reminder of the Empire's reach. What sets Impalement apart is the way it merges brutality with symbolism. The victim's body, elevated upon the stake, became a living proclamation of power, a banner of fear. In this, the Ottomans echoed a truth that tyrants across history have known. Terror can be more effective than swords, and the memory of pain can outlast the memory of conquest. Though centuries have passed, the legacy of impalement lingers in the imagination. It is spoken of in whispers, recorded in chronicles, remembered in nightmares. In the Ottoman Empire, as in other realms, it was never merely a punishment. It was a spectacle, a lesson, and a warning. It was death turned into theater, agony made eternal by the gaze of all who witnessed it.